PR Live, sir.
Hello, good evening from India, and good morning in other parts of the world, especially in the United States. This is Dr. Negin Paul-Kipkin. I'm the Executive Director of Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Welcome to this panel discussion on Myanmar military coup and the way forward. And we're here with distinguished guest speakers from around the world. Before we formally begin our session, I would like to invite my research analyst, Sanjana Dhar, to say a few welcome words. Sanjana?
Good evening to one and all. I, on behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University, would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, participants, and audience. Today's topic for discussion is Myanmar military coup, the way forward. And we have here with us a panel of seasoned experts, and it is my pleasure to introduce them. Our first speaker, Mr. Larry Jagan, is a veteran journalist who has reported developments in Myanmar since the massive pro-democracy demonstration of 1988. He is currently a freelance correspondent, independent analyst, journalism trainer, and media consultant based in Bangkok, but regularly visiting Yangon. He is best known for his coverage of Myanmar, which can regularly be found at the Bangkok Post and South Asian Monitor. Before that, he was the BBC World Service's news and current affairs editor for Asia and the BBC's Myanmar correspondent for more than 10 years. He is also the author of 2 books on Myanmar and numerous academic papers. Today, he will be discussing the outcomes of the November 8th election and fraud allegations. Our second speaker, Dr. John G. Dale, is Associate Professor of Sociology at John Mason University and served as Graduate Program Director of Sociology from 2012 to 2016. He earned his PhD in Sociology from the University of California, Davis, and conducted his dissertation field research in Myanmar among underground organizations of the pro-democracy movement in 1997-98. He was an Open Society Foundation International Liaison of Sociology to University of Yangon in 2014 as well. He is author of Free Burma, Transnational Legal Action and Corporate Accountability, and co-author of Political Sociology, Power and Participation in the Modern World. He is a longtime observer of the politics of civil society in Myanmar and regularly provides analysis to major media outlets around the world. In today's discussion, he will be shedding light on the military coup and the state of emergency currently prevailing there. Our third speaker, Dr. Marco Bunter, is Professor of Asian Politics at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. His research focuses on issues of democratization and authoritarian resilience, civil-military relations, and social movements, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Malaysia. For today's discussion, he will be assessing if the democratic transition in Myanmar has stalled. And last but not the least, our fourth speaker, Dr. Bridget Welsh, is an independent scholar and political analyst currently based in Kuala Lumpur. She is currently an honorary research associate with the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute, Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. She is also a senior research associate of the Hu Feng Center for East Asia Democratic Studies of National Taiwan University and a senior associate fellow of the Habibi Center. She specializes in Southeast Asian politics with a focus on Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, and Indonesia. An author and editor of numerous books, reports, and articles, her last report is Grappling with Transition, Myanmar's 2019 Asia Barometer Findings. She received her PhD in political science from Columbia University, language training at Cornell University, and BA from Colgate University. In today's discussion, she will analyze how the international community should respond to the situation. The panel discussion will be chaired by Dr. Negin Pauki. I would once again like to welcome all our speakers and especially thank them for sparing their valuable time to be a part of this event and make it a success. I would now like to open the floor to the chair for the commencement of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjana, once again. As a chair of the Center for Southeast Executive Director of Center for Southeast Asian Studies and chair of this session. Once again, would like to welcome some of the best people on the field or on the subject to talk about the military coup. Since we don't have much time, I would like to get started, and would like to invite the first speaker, Larry Jagan. Larry, before I just, I asked you to give your speech. There are a few things I would like to inform as the listeners who are online. There will be, each speaker will get 12 minutes, then that will be followed by a Q&A session. And I would like to invite all the listeners or participants around the world, if you have questions, so please submit them through the chat box so that we can go through those questions, because there won't be time to go, all the questions that you have submitted, but we'll try to make sure as much as possible to give it to the speaker for them to respond to those questions. So having said that, I would like to invite the first speaker, our friend Larry Jagan from, Larry, you have 12 minutes.
Thank you. Well, it seems rather dated to be talking about the elections on the day that at least 7 people were killed in Mandalay, 17 were seriously, critically injured, and at least 35 others were wounded. This really highlights what I wanted to talk about, which is actually the clash of cultures in Myanmar. The election was not an election in a conventional sense. This was a competition between different views of democracy. It was an election between generations. In terms of the basic approach to the election, it was red against green. The main determinant of people coming out to vote was the military. They did not want the military to take over again. They did not want to go down the road of repression and incompetence of the past. In the period before the elections, although I'm unfortunately stuck in Bangkok for all sorts of reasons, one of which was essentially COVID and not being able to get back into Myanmar for travel restrictions. Now it seems I'm back on the blacklist and won't be allowed in anyway. Reminds me of the 1990s, which when I first began to cover Myanmar and in the aftermath of the '88 demonstrations. So I've had eyes and ears, lots of different friends and students of mine that I have taught over the years in Myanmar, going out and interviewing people about their intentions in the election. And I would say that in the 3 weeks before the elections, throughout the country, we interviewed 100 people. Admittedly, this was not scientific, and academics will turn up their noses and eyebrows, I'm sure. But it was very clear, 75% of the people we interviewed said they were going to vote for the NLD for all sorts of reasons. Many of them simply, we love Ma Su, Mother Su. We want to support them. Most of them in their answers would say, we do not want to return to the military rule. So there was little doubt that that was a motivation. One worried about just what sort of participation there would be, how many people would actually come out and vote. There were views, and I had heard this from the leaders of the NLD. They were worried, really, for 18 months before the elections, would they be able to mobilize the grassroots support that they have? They felt that people would have assumed that the NLD would win and therefore they didn't have to go out and vote. There were those who would have had a certain amount of skepticism about the last 5 years. And there'll be other areas where the ethnic minorities might actually be able to capitalize on their aspirations and vision of the future. That, of course, in terms of the interviews we did, didn't prove to be the case. And I was quite confident that we were going to see an overwhelming victory for the NLD. What I didn't expect was the turnout. Most of what we were discovering was that people weren't keen to go out and vote. Many of them because of COVID. They said they didn't feel that it was safe. It was a health risk. But they were clear about who they wanted to win. As the election became closer, Min Aung Hlaing's interference and political statements really catalyzed the young people. And this is what was very clear from the interviews we did. The young people were the ones who came out and voted for the NLD and particularly for Daw Suu. But it wasn't for her in particular, it was for democracy. They would always say, we want democracy. We want actually to see the transition to democracy sped up. We want to see constitutional change. We want to see a federal state. And when analysts were suggesting that maybe less than 50% of the electorate would come out and vote, I was quite confident that actually it was going to be at least 70%. Well, of course, it was closer to 85%. And it was this fear of the military taking over that prompted people to come out and vote. So it's very clear the NLD won a popular mandate at those elections. Even when I spoke to Kokoji and Tet Tet Kain after the election, I said, look, did the rightful party win? And they both said yes. Of course, there were irregularities, there were problems. It was a flawed election in terms of the voter list, in terms of the way in which the election was carried out. But they also said, look, we saw that also in the case of the 2015 election. It was certainly the case in the 2010 election. So that wasn't a real problem. Of course, the military then seized on it because they didn't like the result. And yes, they have, as they tell me, at least over 10 million cases of irregularities. There's no doubt there were irregularities, but were they sufficient to overturn the election result? I don't believe that was the case. In fact, several even NLD people said, we suspect that perhaps we could have lost, at most, maybe 20 seats if it was investigated. Now, I do think that the NLD made a strategic mistake in not acknowledging that there were problems with the electoral process and not agreeing to some kind of independent assessment. Of course, allowing the military and the UEC to do that assessment, I think, would have been foolish. But some kind of independent international assessment. It's something that's being proposed to the government, the new junta now, really calling their bluff. But in the bottom line was the military had no intentions of allowing Daw Suu and the NLD to take power. This has been a characteristic since 1990. We know that in 1990, they convincingly won the election and weren't allowed to govern. The pretext was that actually this was an election for a national convention. 2015, of course, they overwhelmingly won it. But at that time, the issue was they couldn't rule without the military's approval. There were meetings with Min Aung Hlaing and with Than Shwe, getting their acceptance. And I believe that in the end, that they reluctantly agreed because as far as they were concerned, let's allow a properly democratic civilian government to take control of the general administration, just to see what happens. And most of the military people that I'm in touch with, some of whom I'm still in touch with, said she won't last more than 6 months. She won't last more than 12 months. It's not going to work. they were convinced she was going to fail. Of course, she didn't. Did she do as much as she should have or could have? No. Was there dissatisfaction with the progress in those 5 years up until 2020 November? Yes, but it was still much better than the people on the whole felt that a military-led government would have. So there's no doubt that this was a popular mandate that they had. But as far as the military was concerned, they did not like it. They thought there was going to be a hung parliament. They thought that actually there would be enough extra ethnic parties, other democratic parties, so that in fact the military would have essentially the balance of power. And that is the vision the military has.
Paper out to fill this thing.
They want a military dominated system. They're looking for a pluralist democracy that has military integrated, very much in the same way as said that I would see Thailand. That didn't work. And we see on the streets, Generation Z, the young people have a different view of democracy, and they are forcefully pushing it. I think I've gone over time.
Okay, are you done, Larry?
Should I get?
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to you, Larry. So now we'll go to the second speaker, John Dell from George Mason University. He's going to talk about the military coup and the state of emergency. Even though he's from sociology background, I'm requesting him to speak on the military coup and the state of emergency. So John, I don't know if you feel comfortable doing that, but please try your best. And we'll come back with questions from the audience.
Thank you. It was thrilling for me to see in 2015 many of the people I'd come to know in the pro-democracy movement for the previous 17 years, now themselves democratically elected and leading a civilian government. But even so, it was clear that Myanmar's military had not truly relinquished its governing power to a civilian government. The telltale sign was the escape clause it had left buried within its newly reformed 2008 constitution. Section 417 reads, if there's a sufficient reason for the disintegration of the Union due to acts or attempts to take over the sovereignty of the Union by insurgency, violence, or wrongful forcible means, the President may, after coordinating with the National Defense and Security Council, declare a state of emergency. Section 418 goes on to explain that the President shall declare the transferring of legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the Union to the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Services to enable him to carry out necessary measures to restore the Union. All legislative functions of Parliament will be suspended and dissolved automatically from the day of declaration of the state of emergency. As we know, on February 1st, less than 3 weeks ago, Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Services Min Aung Hlaing invoked this declaration of a state of emergency. The military took a play right from the playbook of Donald Trump when they falsely denounced Myanmar's November democratic elections as fraudulent. The only difference is that the Tatmadaws coup was successful. After arresting the NLD's elected officials in the middle of the night, just before they were to hold session in Parliament to formally seat their president, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing instantiated Vice President U Myint Sue as the interim president, claiming to be acting in accordance with the Constitution. It is questionable that he had the power to sidestep the actual President Win Myint, whom he had arrested, since that power would come only after a declaration of a state of emergency that requires the president's approval, which Win Myint never provided. Setting aside this contradiction for a moment, we might say that in this sense, the current situation is arguably different than when U Ne Win took power in 1962 via the Revolutionary Council, or when General Saw Maung took power in the 1988 uprising. Influential Arakanese politician Dr. Ai Maung, recently released from prison, where he had served only 2 years of a 20-year prison sentence for high treason and sedition, told reporters that according to the 2008 Constitution, power is transferred only after a state of emergency. After that, there's a promise to hold elections. It remains to be seen whether the council will be made up of civilians. It is not a coup d'etat. We understand it as a transfer of power. As a result, the ethnic nationalities understand that it is a situation where both ears are open. But contrary to Dr. Ai Maung's characterization that this is not or not yet necessarily a coup d'etat, we might say that the 2008 Constitution laid the legalistic groundwork for justifying a military coup via a declaration of a state of emergency, even when it disrupts the final stages of the democratic election process. This law, a legacy of military authoritarianism, was always meant to be a safeguard to prevent the military from losing control over Myanmar's governance. Democracy was never the military's priority. Protesters sustaining Myanmar's civil disobedience movement today understand this, and this is why they're opposing the coup and calling not only for democracy, but also constitutional reform. The question, of course, is why now? Why now has the military chosen to disrupt democratic elections? To suggest simply that it's because they lost does not explain why they had not done so in 2010, when they lost the first democratic election since 1990, which they also lost, but in which case they refused to transfer power to Aung San Suu Kyi. The answer does have much to do with Aung San Suu Kyi. Foreign observers have been paying so much attention to the populist-fueled rise of Aung San Suu Kyi that when she disappointed people with her callous response to the Rohingya genocide, they began focusing on her as a personalist dictator towing the military's line. It should be noted that populist-fueled personalist dictatorship is a pathway to authoritarianism that in the past 2 decades around the world has become more common than by way of military coups. Aung San Suu Kyi herself has little more to lose in terms of her international reputation as a human rights advocate at this point, but she still had much to gain in terms of domestic politics. Her decision as foreign minister to engage in the International Court of Justice last year suddenly created political space for her to differentiate herself as a leader of the NLD party from the military's competing political party, the USDP, prior to the 2020 general election. Suu Kyi as state counselor and the NLD have consistently pressed the military to agree to amending the Constitution without success, arguing that it's essential to building a democratic country and ending the military's involvement in politics. Framing her civilian government's willingness to engage, even if short of embracing, the ICJ's perspective on Myanmar's human rights practices allowed her to contrast the military as relatively isolationist. Thus, she used her appearance before the ICJ to portray herself domestically as fighting for greater democracy, at least, despite the short political leash with which the military is constitutionally able to constrain her. Whether this move actually translated into significantly greater support at the elections is hard to say, but it showed the military that Suu Kyi could not be trusted to do their unbridled bidding, particularly after election results that could enable her to claim a nationwide mandate for constitutional reform. Still, the military thought they would be elected in the recent democratic elections and be able to seat their own party's president. When that strategy failed, the military sensed a tension not between democracy and authoritarianism, so much as a tension between 2 competing sources of authoritarian control in Myanmar. Suu Kyi's populist-fueled authoritarianism and their own authoritarianism that had been long ensconced and institutionalized since the military's 1962 and even baked into the Constitution itself. But the recent coup is different than those of the past for another significant reason as well. The military's capacity for organized state repression has never been greater due to a third source of authoritarianism that has been on the rise in Myanmar since 2014, digital authoritarianism. I wrote about this in the months before the 2015 elections in an article called Smart Transitions, Foreign Investment, Disruptive Technology, and Democratic Reform in Myanmar. When Myanmar opened up its state monopoly on internet service provision to foreign companies, allowing Norway-based Telenor and Qatar-based Ooredoo to build a massive internet infrastructure to develop smart city governance in Naypyidaw Yangon, and Mandalay. Many observers cheered the move as a further step toward democracy, but its regulation and development seems to be much in line with what the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee last July accused China of spearheading through its efforts at the United Nations International Telecommunications Union to create a new global internet protocol that China claims would better serve 5G and future 6G technologies, and which would sustain the kind of state surveillance its own internet infrastructure enables. Myanmar already has been using its capacity to selectively shut down the internet, in some cases for more than a year, in conflict zones like Rakhine and Chin states, preventing not only collective opposition, but even the coordination of humanitarian aid to communities there. And during the Saffron Revolution over a decade ago, when internet penetration was still weak, the military used internet-based state surveillance to trace and arrest thousands of pro-democracy activists. Our friends in India, the largest democracy in the world, is nevertheless no stranger to internet shutdowns. They've experienced over 400 of them in the past 4 years, 7 since the new year, and 5 of which targeted the farmers' protest site in the border areas of Delhi. It prompted Congress leader Anand Sharma this month to describe India as the internet shutdown capital of the world. For the past 7 nights, according to NetBlocks and the Internet Observatory, Myanmar's military has imposed internet cuts and even restricted key providers like Ooredoo and Telenor. In a statement, Telenor said authorities had ordered a nationwide shutdown of the network, citing circulation of fake news, stability of the nation, and interest of the public as a basis for the order. The shutdown has stoked speculation, according to the India Times and Financial Times, that Myanmar's military is installing a site-censoring Great Firewall with China's help. The military denied China was building a firewall, adding that Myanmar had enough experts to do so itself, reports this morning's Financial Times. Ironically, it was Myanmar's civilian government that in 2013 enacted the telecommunications law, which established the regulatory framework for foreign investment into Burma's telecommunications infrastructure. And it was on this law that it relied to hinder the freedom of expression. Section 77 of that same law authorizes the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology to order the suspension of telecom services in emergency situations. However, there are no criteria as to what can trigger such a suspension. This allows the government to shut down internet and mobile communications arbitrarily, which often immediately precedes crackdowns on peaceful demonstrators or other human rights violations. This is what we're seeing now. And last weekend, Myanmar's military suspended democratic provisions of the privacy law, which had prohibited household arrests and inspections without a warrant, as well as state surveillance of individuals and their private communications and detentions of civilians for more than 24 hours without a court ruling. The military is also seeking to impose a new cybersecurity, or shall we say cyber censorship law, that would grant it almost unlimited power to access user data and imprison opponents of the regime who express their views on the internet, as well as officials at non-complying companies. Also, anyone accessing sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which have been banned in the wake of the coup, via virtual private network applications, would be subject to arrest. The Asia Internet Coalition released a statement last week condemning this proposed cybersecurity bill as granting its leaders unprecedented power to censor citizens and violate their privacy, and said that it would contravene democratic norms and fundamental rights guaranteed under international law. I will quickly conclude by saying what we have in Myanmar at this juncture is not only a military's state of exception, legalistically, though perhaps not legally justified as a constitutional state of emergency, but also one that is reinforced by a new state of emerging digital authoritarianism. This round of conflict in Myanmar, I fear, will be more violent and protracted than the conflicts we've witnessed in Myanmar in 1988 or 2007. It will look more like Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020. To effect a better outcome will require even more local, transnational, and international commitment to democracy and human dignity, as well as new mechanisms for conflict resolution. And toward that end, big tech firms cannot afford to remain on the sidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Now we come to the third speaker, Dr. Marco Bunter. Marco, before you speak on the topic, there are a lot of talks about whether the transition has been completely we'll call disrupted, or is it temporary? So I would like you to please capture some of those points in your talk. And of course, we'll come back with questions from the audience toward the end of the program. And I just would like to remind the audience again that this is being recorded and it's also streamed live on YouTube. And we'll try to make this available this evening or tomorrow morning itself. So if you have any questions, so please submit through the chat box so that we can take up those questions and let the speakers address them. So please submit your questions to this chat box. Now, may I invite the third speaker, Dr. Marco Bunter, to talk about, has the market transition stalled? Marco, you have 12 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to voice out my opinion in this very interesting discussion under the heading, has democratization stalled? At the moment, we are certainly a bit in uncharted waters, since we do not know how the protest movement outside plays out and what will be the reaction of the military to these protests. So it's very, very difficult to say how this plays out. First, the coup is a very big step backward. With the coup, without the coup, we would have maybe seen a democratic government for the first time appointing a new commander-in-chief in summer, which would have allowed Aung San Suu Kyi to reign into the Tatmadaw. And this may be also one of the core motives, one of the core corporate motives for the coup, which pushed Min Aung Hlaing to act. Apart from this, there is his personal ambition, and I think this has been said, the overall fear to lose control. But I think there are other issues here, and particularly to the question whether democratization has stalled. The military apparently was very unhappy with the power sharing arrangement it had installed. Remember that a true democracy was never the intended outcome of this process. So the military wanted to establish a disciplined, flourishing democracy, which may be described better as a tutelary regime in which the military is having a leading role. And they needed 2 whole decades to establish this form of regime with the core of the 2008 constitution, which contains many liberal and illiberal elements, but it secured basically the military's role in the national leadership of the state. And the military, you know that, has both legislative and executive tasks and is the guardian of the constitution, technically overseeing this system. So it let the 2015 elections go, and these were considered as relatively free and fair, according to the election observers. And the military invited the democratic government then to form the civilian arm of the government. In 2020, although the international election observers have basically said that these elections were relatively free, at least they reflected the mirrored the sentiments of the population. The military was apparently very unhappy. Larry has spoken about this. And so it, in the end, is this repeated landslides what the military is actually unhappy about. So where do we go on from here? We basically, the military made very clear that it is not a coup, but that it is constitutionally allowed, and maybe the military wants to go back. They did not destroy the 2008 constitution, but apparently we will hear in the future a little bit about the real election outcome. So they will explain about the real election outcome, maybe work on this. And what we actually might see is that the NLD might be either destroyed or seriously blocked in future elections. So, and this is a very big setback for the democracy and for the power sharing in the country. At the same time, the junta is trying to woo ethnic nationality parties and try to bring them on their side. So basically, the junta at the moment wants to move on, but the current mass protests and the civil disobedience movement is showing a strong sign and apparently surprising them that they want democracy to be restored and that they want to be the democratic government in place. So where does that leave us? It is in the general's hand. We cannot look into the top leadership of the military. It is a black box, and whether we will see a violent crackdown as in 1988 or whether a more reformist line in the military will evolve, we have to see. But when we want to see true democratization moving forward, we need basically a different line of the military to come forward in order to maybe have the NLD being brought into the political process. So the current junta, I think they will make that clear that the NLD does not play a role in the future elections or the court cases against Aung San Suu Kyi and the president already show in that direction. And but we do not know how the actually mass protests, how that plays out. I leave it here with this kind of open scenario. I think the new military junta wants to move on, but the people do not want them to move on, and so that is very very clear. And so we have to wait how they move on to these demonstrations and how they react to this, and whether we see maybe a line in the military, a stream in the military. It's not about what we have seen in the past, policemen or even minor ranked generals switching sides. That's not the point. These has to be large-scale defections, and the military is not known for having these. And it's a very, apparently a very strong institution with a very strong esprit de corps, and so this is very unlikely that we see move on this side. And so I personally fear a violent crackdown somewhere in the future. And then we need to see how the military wants to move on and include or co-opt some of their partners, particularly the ethnic groups. Maybe the military also wants to woo over the West by offering a new policy in Rakhine State in order to approach Western countries. But I think this is what the military might have in mind in order to move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bunter. We'll come back with questions, definitely. There are some of the points that you have mentioned are, debatable, and maybe some people might find it controversial, especially if you're from the other party or from the other side of the spectrum. But we'll come back with questions on that in a few minutes. And now I would like to invite our fourth speaker, Dr. Bridget Welsh, to talk about how should the international community respond? Because so far we have seen that there is a division. This is not something new. We have seen in the past, the West versus the neighboring countries. So now let's hear from Dr. Welsh. How do you say the international community should respond to this happening or development in Myanmar? You have 12 minutes.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this very important panel on these issues in Myanmar. I think to begin the discussion of what should be done is not necessarily what can be done. I think that the should part is clearer, that they should work towards ensuring a more meaningful democratic situation in the country, one that is more inclusive than what was happening previously, that addresses the issues of the Rohingya, and of course tries to work towards addressing some of the very persistent ethnic conflicts. But these are very difficult challenges. What can be done? I think from the onset, from the international community, and even in Myanmar itself, needs to recognize that there are constraints and limits. The solutions for the problems in Myanmar have to ultimately come from Myanmar itself, from the people inside. That said, I think at the international level, there are important actions that can be taken at many different levels. And what we're seeing compared to the past are a broader range of lessons that are actually happening already and very slowly. We're seeing in the past couple of weeks a whole series of initiatives that are taking place. We've seen it in the case of sanctions, targeted sanctions on the part of the United States. You will make a decision, I understand, on Monday, whether or not what type of sanctions will be introduced. We have a situation where we have Indonesia pushing with Malaysia for a meeting and a statement from ASEAN partners, a special meeting. That meeting among ASEAN will not be held till April, but there's likely potentially to be a meeting beforehand, negotiating with countries such as Singapore and also engaging with Brunei, who is the chair of ASEAN. We've seen middle parties try to negotiate with the military in terms of independent assessments on the elections. And we've also seen issues and discussions both on issues of the Rohingya with the Bangladesh government, but also in terms of pressures from different actors across the world, and particularly among ordinary citizens that have now set up support groups for the protesters, as well as issues involving the discussing of boycotts. I think in order to look to the present, we need to look to the past. And I think while I agree with the earlier speakers that this particular event and context have some very important differences, there are also some lessons of the past that help us look at what can be done now, and that actually can have traction. And I think the first of which is to recognize that protests historically have not been enough to address the underlying problems in the system. And I think that while the protests bring international attention and they help to mobilize the opposition, and this is an important development that's happening in Myanmar right now, we're seeing new political forces emerging in that society outside of the NLD, which I believe is a healthy development. But I think at the same time, the protests, even though they are, I think, very powerful, very broad, involving different generations, particularly Generation Z. They themselves, historically, as we've seen in the past, may not be enough, especially if the worrying crackdown continues. We've seen very disturbing developments of what's happened in Mandalay today. And I think that these are things that really create very significant worries about the impact of the sustainability of the protests. But that said, I think one of the interesting features that can actually be broader in the contemporary environment are efforts to actually support the protesters. There have now been tremendous amount of support groups to provide aid, food aid, funding, telecommunication support. There are websites and support networks that are actually channeling support into these protesters. And I think this is something very important as one of the solutions, or one of the basket of solutions as things move forward. I think the second thing to look in the past is to recognize that it is not productive to allow the international responses to be something that the military can use to its advantage. What we saw is in the past is that they have been able to use issues of sanctions as a way to justify their tenure. I think this is partly explaining why we're seeing targeted sanctions, but it's also the fact is that the tool that the international community has given them is that they are able to play off countries against each other, to play off the United States against China. The great power struggle that is existing between US and China in some ways gives the junta, the Tatmadaw in Myanmar advantage. And I think that if this issue in Myanmar coup is seen as us versus them situation, this actually empowers the military. And I think this is an important dynamic to understand, is that it's not in the interest to use Myanmar as a proxy situation in the competition with China. And I think that this is something that is clear also in part of the policy making in the West. And I think that this is not constructive. I think that China, in dialogue with China, is an important discussion. And to recognize that while China clearly is supporting the junta, there are many Chinas, and they need to working with China to work towards a better solution in Myanmar is an important part of the repertoire of things, international responses. I think the third lesson we learned is that sanctions did a lot of harm for Myanmar people, and so this is why we're seeing targeted sanctions. And I think that the targeted sanctions are an important avenue and tool. They've been focused on individuals and companies. It is my view that these targeted sanctions need to go further and that they need to expand to include third-party components so that allies internationally that are working with these parties and individuals, companies, need to be put on notice. And this means that this will have impact on other countries in the region, particularly key countries that invest with Myanmar, with the military individuals in Myanmar. And I think this takes an important clarity in identifying the actors and making sure that the harm is and the sanctions are focused, and actually that this does put a pressure on the key pressure points in this regard. I think strategically, what we learned from the lesson of the transition in Myanmar is that the military should not be seen as a cohesive unit. And in fact, the transition in Myanmar came from a split military. And I think it's in this regard, focusing specifically on Min Aung Hlaing and key individuals and recognizing the splits is an important component. Creating divisions within the system, working with those and expanding those divisions is a very important part about bringing about a more democratic system, because the more you push the military together, the more it's going to be to dig its heels in. And it is already an institution that lives in a kind of parallel world and has parallel thinking that people don't necessarily embrace. So I think it is important to look to those divisions in important ways, and to focus the energies in particular on the key architects of the junta. And in part, that one of the elements and solutions to that is to put Min Aung Hlaing on notice for his activities as commander-in-chief involving the Rohingya, but also in terms of the activities that are happening now. Any crackdown, these are the individuals that are responsible, and the international community has areas like the ICJ and others to use at their disposal that I think should be considered as things move forward. We also learn that policies in the past, if they go on a simple basis by themselves, one country or a series of countries, don't necessarily work. Now, the reality of ASEAN, the reality of the global situation, not just COVID, and also a weakened United States because of the Trump administration and many other factors, and that is a declining power in the context of Asia, that this situation in Myanmar offers an opportunity for new types of alliances. and new roles in those alliances. And I think that thinking about things in traditional organizations like structures like ASEAN are not necessarily as effective. So let me sort of conclude with a couple key suggestions in thinking about things forward. I think that we have focused my conversations particularly on strategic targeting and some of the actions of actors. But I think that ultimately I'd conclude by saying that the actions of ordinary people are especially important, and businesses and companies. And I think these are going to be something that's going to be fundamentally different in this particular environment than in the past. The strategies of engagement transnationally, supporting opposition, supporting businesses that empower people within Myanmar and practices that empower people within Myanmar will be very important moving forward. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Wells, for your insightful comments. Definitely we will have come. There are already a lot of questions in the chat box. We'll try to go through them as much as possible. But before I give a chance to the audience, as a chair of the session, I would like to take advantage and ask maybe one very short question to each speaker. If I may start from the first speaker, which Larry, are you there, Larry?
Yep.
Okay, Larry, I just want to start off with you by saying that, I mean, those who follow those who follow the political developments in Myanmar, we are a little bit stuck here. I mean, between what we call the allegations versus the rejection from the Union Election Commission of over 8.4 million voting or voting irregularities in the country. So and we know that under the UEC, the electoral laws, UEC has the final say on electoral matters. Then how come these the allegations of voting irregularities has become a reason for the coup that we see? But then now, where does it go? I mean, are they trying to resolve this one, or is it this was just an excuse for them to take over power?
I think it's more complicated. I mean, first of all, there's little question in my mind that these allegations in terms of a stolen election, and I really, really do not accept any analogy with Trump. I know Sormong and the others who are leading the legal attacks on it. They do not look to the US. They know exactly what they're doing because they wrote the laws. They know how to manipulate it. Now, even they, and then someone has asked a question, have you seen any evidence of these irregularities? Well, in fact, I have. The military have shared some of them with me, not all 10.4 million, and they say that's 25% of the population. Well, yes, of course it's 25% of the population, but it doesn't mean that the election in any particular place is invalid. Certainly there are irregularities. The NLD approach of not giving respect to these allegations, I think, is at the core of some of this. And there's little doubt in my mind, unfortunately, that Aung San Suu Kyi saw this electoral victory as an endorsement, and in fact it was an endorsement, but it hardened her position vis-a-vis the military, and it made her arrogant. I mean, understand that she told friends, "We've won, well, we can move forward." Because I have little doubt, unlike the international community who condemn her in terms of Rakhine and what have you, I think she had no option but to try and find a path to work with the military, at least for the 5 years she was in power before the 2020 elections. You know, she has told me that until the middle of March 2016, they did not know whether they were going to be allowed to rule. But at the middle of March, they were given the signal. So now she felt morally superior because she certainly sort of feels that this has given her authority. And so I think that arrogance was a mistake. They should have been more conciliatory. They should have said, okay, as they are now behind the scenes, let's have an international independent commission that looks at these allegations and assesses them. I think that should have happened before, not now. But the military were worried that as soon as the parliament opened on that Monday, and that's why they moved, they thought on Saturday that actually the NLD was going to delay it. The NLD should have delayed it until the Supreme Court had decided whether there was a case to answer. Now, of course, the Supreme Court has been changed, so they have no control. There's no judicial independence. So there's no doubt that there were irregularities. Would it have overturned the election? But that was a pretext to push what the military wants, and that is a pluralist democracy. They want to integrate the military and other sectional interests into government in many ways exactly like Thailand. And after all, Min Aung Hlaing was the adopted son of Prem, and he's taken a lot from the Thai experience. Now, on the ethnic minorities, he's really out at sea. The ethnic minority, the ethnic armed organizations this afternoon put out a statement saying, we support the CDM. We do not want, we are going to cancel talks with the military until further notice. We want all prisoners released, and we want dialogue and mediation to happen. Now that, I think, actually has to be what the international community supports. We've had the Sangha come out 2 days ago saying we need mediation. We had Archbishop Charles Bow saying the same, and that's what has to happen. And I think ASEAN is in a good position to try and say, okay, we can help as an interlocutor to get to mediate and get you to talk. This is not going to. This is not a win-win situation. The military have to be involved to some extent. And I disagree with anyone who suggests that the military are anything but 100% behind Min Aung Hlaing. And I don't believe their vision has anything to do with Min Aung Hlaing's personal political future. Most people I know in the military actually think he's a desk general who the sooner he retires, the better. But when the institution of the army is attacked, they all fall in line. So the way forward has to be in terms of mediation. And part of that mediation has to be an international independent commission that looks at these allegations of election fraud.
All right. Okay, thank you, Larry. We'll try to come back to you. Now to John. John, this is a question from my side, and I'm also trying to bring on some of the questions in the chat box, trying to put together in one question. In recent days, I mean, in fact, it's already been a few days now, John, the new authorities in Naypyidaw has instructed the media not to call them as a junta or a military coup. But we saw, I mean, all the signs that we have seen are no less than any previous military coups in the past of the Myanmar history. So having seen that, and also we see that the Myanmar military says that they are following in accordance of the constitution. So what do you see? Whether this is should be called genuinely, truly, it's a military coup and it becomes a military dictatorship, or do you believe that they are, the military's claim of them following or acting in accordance with the constitution they drafted? So what do you see about the coup, John?
Well, as I was arguing earlier, I do think that this is a coup. I don't agree with Dr. Ai Mong's characterization of this as just a transfer of power, in part precisely because what Larry was saying a minute ago. I see his argument that this was a pretext for transferring power, taking over, is exactly right. It's just a pretext. It's one thing to suggest there are irregularities, which, as Larry pointed out, happen in every democratic election. It happened in the United States. That's not the question. To call it fraudulent is a different characterization. And that was the pretext that they used to stop the NLD from seating their president that had won in the election and now take power away for at least a year. Now, it could be a temporary coup. That doesn't make it any less a coup. There are questions about whether they followed the letter of the Constitution in terms of that transfer of power, as I pointed out. That didn't come from the sitting president. They arrested that president and then went ahead and instantiated a vice president who would go ahead and transfer that power to the senior general, or the commander. But that is a contradiction that I think will have to be played out by the lawyers. I think they would try to follow the Constitution as much as they could, but I don't think the rule of law there would have stopped them from doing what they wanted to do. So that's, does that answer your question?
Yeah, very much, definitely. Thank you, John. I will come back to you. All right, now coming to Marco. I think you and I, and of course all the panelists here, being experts on Myanmar, we have studied not just in the recent days or the recent weeks, but from the many years of Myanmar's history. And of course, we knew that there's the so-called 7-step roadmap toward democracy was officially announced by the former Prime Minister, General Kim Yoon, whom I met him in 2004. During my meeting, he said, Myanmar needs to follow its own way of democratization. And so you have talked about some of the historical developments with regard to democratic transition. So Marco, what do you think? Is the country still has a chance to move toward what it calls a genuine, disciplined, flourishing democracy if the military is going to stay on power for another year? Or in other words, after 1 year of this the emergency rule, do you think the country is going to go back to the path of its democratic transition, or do you think it's going to drastically change? Or maybe perhaps the military might hang on to power for as long as possible? Marco, your view.
Yeah, that's very difficult to answer at this point of time. This was what is normally a promissory coup. I mean, in terms of in the name of democracy, for bringing real democracy and handing over power to a future democratic government. But when you look at that throughout the world, it is always longer than promised. My personal view is that the new junta tries to I don't know, map out a new situation, bring in new allies maybe in order to turn back to a situation maybe in like 2010. And go back then, I mean, what Larry called pluralist democracy. I mean, I have a different view on democracy here. I mean, it was not a genuine democratization. There were free elections in 2015, certainly, but the military institutionalized its power as a way out. And then we have a genuine power sharing between civilians and the military at this point of time. It is very difficult to tell at this point of time what will happen in a year, particularly with the young generation out there and voicing out their demand, voicing very clearly that they will not accept going back to the past. I think this is what everybody fears, that going back to the dark ages without internet, without communications and so on, so that you certainly might not take away all the freedoms again. So this is why the new generation is out there. I think John said that. But and that is very important. Although the military is certainly not a unitary actor, they fall back into line of their commander-in-chief once they are under pressure. And actually, I see that the political dynamics point to a long-term military takeover at the moment, but it's very difficult because it's so volatile with this with the street protests, and as Bridget said, new alliances forming, maybe new actors coming up, and so on. But the military is very clever in either co-opting some of the forces, and we have to wait a little bit. So I certainly cannot at this point say, no, we will go back to direct military rule, because this is what the military does not want, actually. They do not want to go back to the old days, but they want to have a playing field in order, which they can dominate. So the pluralist democracy is more or less military control over various ethnic parties, and you can compare it, as Larry did, to Thailand now, where we have a number of military parties basically in power, and civilian forces as opposition. And every time the civilian opposition gains some votes or power, the court steps in. So this is maybe something the military has in mind, but it's too early to tell at this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Bunter. We'll come back to you again. Dr. Welsh, here's a question for you. We all know that one of the reasons why sanctions has been failing in the past. The past is that because of lack of coordination among international community. We see that on the one hand there are sanctions. On the other we see what they call constructive engagement from neighboring states. So, having seen that, and of course there are different opinions about whether a sanction works or not. Of course, we can keep on arguing that. But the point that I'm trying to make is, what do you see is necessary for the international community? In my recent piece, I argue that at least the democracies of the world should somehow find some kind of a coordinated approach toward Myanmar if they want to see some kind of a real or an effective action on Myanmar. Do you see that international community is lacking? Or is it repeating the same thing that they made mistake in the past? Or do you think there is a change or maybe some sort of a shift in international response to the development in Myanmar?
Many questions there.
Yeah, so there are. Yes. I'm trying to bring together different questions in the chat box into one, please.
No problem. I wanted to sort of speak to two things that I've said earlier, and then directly raise your question. I think Larry made a very important point about the importance of dialogue, and I agree that dialogue has to be part of the discussion with the military. I think also with the NLD, different components in society, and different actors. I slightly differ with Larry in that I think that I don't think that the election, I think the election was an excuse for things that were long-term. And here where we go back to where the issues are, the more fundamental issues about power sharing, the role that the military plays, these are the things that need to be discussed. And I think that these are very difficult issues. They're within the heart of the problems within Myanmar for a long time. But I think that the dialogue is necessary. Why I think the challenge is for ASEAN to do that is that ASEAN itself is very divided. And this, and I come to this in the context of bringing unity that you're speaking about in a second. The second issue I wanted to say, I believe that the military is still operating through very many old playbooks. I feel that in the last few weeks, we've seen a very defensive set of responses, not necessarily very proactive. Well, I do believe the planning for the coup was well before the weekend, before February 1st. I think that the fundamental responses still are blocked in the past, and they're wrestling. with different types of responses, which I think have been overwhelmingly large sections of society. And I think that they are now opening up many fronts for the military. And that, and of course, opens up the opportunity for dialogue. Now to the question of how to find a common ground. I think the common ground has to begin from the premise that this type of government is not good for Myanmar, and it's not good for the region, and it's not from the perspective of Southeast Asia and East Asia. So this is where you build this kind of common ground with allies. And I think that even a China or a Japan or a Thailand, there are genuine reasons to worry about this government, but slightly different reasons, whether or not it is a refugee crisis that emerges or the conflict spilling over, or the fact that you're having an economic step backward for the region when this economy was a growing economy. The discussion can't just be about democratic rule, it has to be about other interests that I think that serve the region. And then how do you build a lowest common denominator approach? I think that the reason why sanctions that are being targeted is an aim to try to build as much ally relationships on these things as possible. The fact of the matter is, however, even within ASEAN, there is resistance from Singapore and Thailand for these types of strategies. And there are clearly resistance from China on these areas. So can this type of policy work on its own? The answer is no. It has to be a repertoire of multiple types of strategies to engage. And this is where I think that you need to recognize that it's not one answer is not going to solve the problems in Myanmar. You need multiple forms of engagement, but it has to begin for the premise that the country has to move forward. This step and the current last 3 weeks is moving the country backward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bridget. We'll come back to you again if we have time. Now going back to the first speaker, Larry. I'm trying to collect some of the pieces of, coming from the chat box as well as based on what we have seen and the developing story on the ground. So Larry, so do you believe that, or do you think that the military leadership, or let's say the State Administrative Council, which is the new name for the military government, do you think that they are underestimating the role of the people? I mean, especially we talk about the CDM, the Civil Disobedience Movement. Is the military leaders underestimating or the people's power in this military coup?
Well, the simple answer is absolutely. They have underestimated. Speaking to some of the CDM leaders this morning, they were saying, we are now people's power. Sure, it's young people who are leading it. It's also very much the CSOs, which weren't around in the 1990s when I was first covering Myanmar. It's a very different country than it was in the 1990s. It's also a very different international and regional environment. We talk about resistance from Singapore and Thailand. Singapore, yes, but the Thais, I'm in constant touch. They're ambivalent at the moment, but they understand that if things actually get worse, and after today in Mandalay, they don't want to see a replica of the early 90s or particularly after 1990 when in the Mandalay Hall they tried to form an alternative government, and they see hundreds and thousands of refugees pouring over the border. And don't forget that some of the key ethnic organizations, the RCSS and the KNU, have actually said anyone who wants to flee from Yangon and Mandalay into our region, we will look after you. But don't expect there to be forests. It's all being cut down. It's a very different situation. I actually do think that if this bloodshed gets worse that we've seen in Mandalay, ASEAN is faced with a real issue, and I know it has to be 9 out of 10 ASEAN members that vote to expel Myanmar, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it happen if there's bloodshed. You have both China, Japan, the UN envoy, and ASEAN quietly saying to the military, whatever you do, no bloodshed. And if there's bloodshed, I don't think they can count on China's support. China wants a peaceful, stable northern Myanmar. And that's not what they've got now. And if the ethnic groups, as they've threatened, I know the KIO and the Northern Alliance haven't been part of what was released today, that's not going to be the case. So I think there is much more maneuverability. The second thing is that this economy is not insular as it was in the 1990s. There are problems around in April, May, when the international community starts looking at issues of money laundering. Already Myanmar has been put onto the grey list and quite likely put on a blacklist. That will automatically put into force a lot of financial sanctions that the regime hasn't counted on. I actually think the regime, the junta, really didn't know what they were doing when they took over. Yes, I agree. This was not a spur of the moment. My sources in the military have told me that for the last 2 years, there's been 200 to 300 intelligence officers, major general above, planning what they always told me, the political future of the military. Now, I know, as they always tell me, there are always 4 plans, 4 scenarios. One might well have been to work with the NLD. The second was definitely the coup. There may have been 2 other options. Now, they may have to think about what these other options are. There's no doubt that, for instance, the banking system is in dire straits. They're worried that actually by the end of the month, there's going to be no actual money for civil servant payments in Yangon. The central bank is in absolute chaos. They are facing a crisis. Now, what's the way out? That's the problem, because the military are very hard-headed, they're very arrogant, and they will not want to lose face. We have to find a face-saving way for them to back down. And I tell you, Generation Z are not going to back down either. I have a couple of friends who are my eyes and ears in Yangon, students that I taught journalism to. And one of them, after the killing or the wounding of the young girl in Naypyidaw, was crying on the phone the next day, whispering, "I don't want to die. I'm scared, Larry, but I have to go out and fight for democracy. I have to support my friends." And I'm hearing this from lots of people. And today I'm hearing we're very, very angry. We're very angry. And I can't see them backing down. So we have to find some way, and that's where the international community is so crucial. And forget the international community, I'm talking about the regional community.
Thank you.
An opportunity for Thailand and Japan to cooperate.
All right, thank you, Larry. We'll come back for the closing remarks on the way forward. Now, if I may go to John. John, the military says that they are acting in accordance with the Constitution. But in one of my recent pieces, I argue that the military violated their own constitution. For example, if you look at section 417 of the article, which says that there should be a coordination between the president and the NDSC, National Defense and Security Council. I mean, that did not happen. In fact, the president and the state council were arrested in the early hours of the February 1st. So, John, can you tell the audience what is your view? Is constitution just an excuse for the military to stage another coup, or do you think they would abide by any kind of future they might be coming up with? I mean, it's likely that they're going to amend or maybe perhaps change entirely the constitution. So what do you see? Are they going to stick to, do you think the military might be or will be sticking to the constitution, whatever form it might be, maybe whenever that comes up or when that comes out? John, what is your view on that?
Well, I believe that 417 and 418 were potentially violated. That was one of the points I was making earlier. So I definitely agree that's a possibility. It looks like a contradiction. They should have gone through the existing president in the declaration of a state of emergency, but they didn't. They arrested him and then instantiated someone else. And I don't know that that actually makes sense, because the only way he could instantiate someone else under those conditions is by declaring a state of emergency that required the president's command. So that's a problem. But that's such a complicated point that your average person, who's not a lawyer perhaps, is really going to drill down on. It looked as though they were invoking legalistically, if not legally, the language of following the Constitution. And we've seen some of the political prisoners they've released towing that line as well. Dr. Ai Mong, for instance, who's now said this was not a coup d'etat, this was a transfer of power. They've promised to wait a year. Let's see what happens if they give control back to the civilians. So they can play those games, all for a long time. I think that's not the point. The point, I think, in the long run is that they are considering already possibly reforming the Constitution in different ways, not in the ways that Aung San Suu Kyi was interested in it. And in addition, they've been creating other laws just this week. And I think the most shocking have been really the cybersecurity law that they're trying to push through. That's a new one. And then the other is, the reinstatement of the overnight guest registration. That's basically a violation of the Privacy Act, but also a violation of what was undone in 2016 to create a more democratic law. So it's not just the Constitution, I think, that's at stake. It's a whole slew of laws that they can now begin to legislate since they are in power, since they claim that power now has been transferred legitimately to them. And what you see in the streets is people contesting that claim. But they have power in the form of guns and everything else. So that's why I think, many of us have been so concerned about not just a crackdown, but something that may be prolonged. And that's why I, made the comparison to Hong Kong. I mean, that lasted a year, and they still lost the pro-democracy movement. So it's going to take something more than that, and certainly we can focus on the laws, but at some point, I think that's it's a legitimate, or how would you say it, a justificatory discourse, way to try and justify this, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily adhering to the law. And I'm not sure at this point that that's where the real battle is being fought anyway.
Thank you, John. We'll come back for the closing remarks. Dr. Marco, so many of us, including you and I, we studied for many years about the process of democratization, what literature says, what theory says, and what we see in Myanmar, which, we can frame, or we can name it in different ways. For example, guided democracy, or let's say incomplete democracy, or defective democracy. So we can use different terminologies, but there are some people who argue that having something is better than having nothing, which means even though democracy is imperfect, as we all agree on that, but still it is better than the past almost 50 years of military rule, having a power sharing system, what we call a hybrid regime. So what is your view as a scholar from academic perspective? Do you see a guided democracy, or let's say incomplete democracy is suitable? Or what we see in the history of Myanmar, they call it, during the Ne Win's era, they call it Burmese way to socialism. And now they're calling it Burmese way to democracy. In other words, a flourishing democracy. So what do you think? Is it having something is better than nothing in the form of guided, or maybe defective, or let's say incomplete democracy? Marco?
Very difficult question, because these names, they they are not really they do not really mean much, right? I mean, who was behind all that? The military is still the most powerful force in the country. And I mean, I think we have made that clear that the military also needs to be part of the solution in terms of a power sharing agreement. And this is at least when you ask for lessons learned from other cases, from Indonesia, for instance. It can start with protests, but the decisions need to be made by elites first. And so someone needs to come out in the military, a new direction, who is able to form a kind of compromise in this kind of situation where we have these mass protests. We have learned, I mean, that we see a new generation coming up, very firm in their demands and so on, but with no proper goals other than we want our government back. So there need to be some kind of negotiation channels, political institutions, which need to work. And I think, I mean, we have left Aung San Suu Kyi out of the whole debate. I mean, is she coming back somehow? That's what people ask in the past, and nobody is really saying no. I think she will not come back because the military will not allow her to. So that will certainly be then one big voice of the whole democracy movement now on the street is against that. Who is really who want Aung San Suu Kyi to be in the place. So, I mean, certainly half a democracy is better than no democracy. That is sure. And we have seen progress in recent years under this kind of power sharing. Minimal, right? I mean, we could have done better, but at least after 50 years of military rule, you also have to work on your expectations. Myanmar will not change overnight. It will take, in Indonesia, it took a decade or half a decade to come to a kind of constitutional compromise, to open up then for introduce direct elections and reform the constitutions and also get the military out. That was half a decade. So that will take time. And certainly it is good to have international mediators, but that the military would not allow non-Asian mediators. So ASEAN is actually here, would be a very good mediator in this process to find common ground.
All right, thank you, Marco. We'll come back for the our closing remark. Dr. Bridget, we are running out of time. Just a quick question for you. We have seen a statement coming out from the Quad countries, United States, Australia, India, and Japan. At least they are calling for the return of democracy in the country. Do you think the Quad countries should do more to convince other like-minded nations, especially democracies of the world, to have what we call a coordinated approach, but then just the Quad countries? So do you think that's necessary, and do you think that's possible?
Important that there be coordination among Western allies and like-minded countries in Asia, such as Japan and India, to work on and trying to strengthen democratic values and democratic practices, both within Myanmar and the region. Absolutely. Is it possible? I think it's going to take time because of the U.S. administration. The previous administration left a lot of damage, and I think that it's not going to be easy to do so. But I also think ultimately, you know, one of the lessons that the West needs to learn is that then the discussion cannot just focus on returning Aung San Suu Kyi back to power. That the issues are much broader than just the NLD government. And I think that, and if that's in returning her to power is only perpetuating some of the confrontation and problems within the system and doesn't necessarily address some of those issues. It's not to say, and I think, so it has to be the conception of what democracy is in Myanmar and the issues that are there have to be thought through more carefully in order to make it a more sustainable solution longer term and not have us speaking about the same issues too much longer.
Thanks, Bridget. We are running out of time, but I would like to give each speaker a closing remark. Larry, if we may start with you, maybe in not longer than 1 minute. What is the way forward?
Well, there's no question the way forward has to meet mediation of some sort. And I've said and ASEAN, perhaps Thailand taking the lead, Japan. Japan has already been offering its services. Sasakawa, the special envoy for the Prime Minister, has spoken to Min Aung Hlaing twice since the coup. There is real possibilities that might move forward. The second is that actually the military have shot themselves in the foot. You talk about people might be happy with half democracy. I'm afraid I have to swear they will not be happy with half democracy. They want constitutional change. They want a federal democratic state. And they have gone past, people on the streets have gone past the NLD. Aung San Suu Kyi's future, I'm afraid, is very limited. There's little doubt in my mind that actually the military regime are going to prevent her standing for elections in the future as a result of this trial. And in many ways, they will then ban the NLD as a party. But that doesn't change the demands of the young people. Sure, they're saying, give us back our leader. But actually, what they want is democracy. Many of them are disillusioned with the NLD. They were campaigning against the NLD before the elections. The whole scenario, the whole situation has changed as a result of the military. They have precipitated this, and their future in terms of controlling politics in Myanmar is limited, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or maybe even 10 years. Although I hope to be able to live long enough to see what I think is actually going to happen.
Thank you, Larry. John, the same question. What is the way forward?
Wish I knew. I agree with a lot of what Larry's saying about the importance of building, international and regional relations. I think there have been a lot of proposals around sanctions and global arms bans at the level of the UN. I'm not hearing very much at this point about getting big tech companies which have become very powerful. And I don't mean just, I know I was talking about China's digital authoritarianism, but there are competing versions out there. Silicon Valley's own surveillance capitalism sometimes looks like a competing form of that, and there's been a lot of reporting in the last few years on that. But I think these companies that currently are in Myanmar, like Telenor and Ooredoo, have been coming out with statements that say, our hands are tied, the government's making us do this, and we have to follow the local laws. Facebook, similarly, they've made a few punches, but I think Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have all now been folded, and no one has access to them in the wake of this. These are very powerful companies that can go beyond just offering their services and can actually be a part of a broader plan to create pressure internationally on the military, should it come to that. I agree with Larry's optimistic outlook for the long term for democracy in Myanmar. In the short term, I think this is going to be very violent and very difficult, and trying to bring in not just states working internationally and not just depending on transnational networks of civilians, but also having to bring in corporations themselves as actors is going to be important. And that's a hard That's a hard thing to accomplish, but they actually have a lot at stake in this.
Thank you, John. Marco, the same question, the way forward.
The international mediation would be a way out, but I don't really see that. So I'm not going to focus on that, but maybe focus on the protest movement and say a few things. So we will basically see an extended period of demonstrations and so on with a grave danger of a crackdown. But what needs to be done is basically A, win the military over, and second, build trust and build up new institutions and build up new political parties, maybe beyond the traditional way, in order to build a foundation for a more sustainable democracy in the future. I think that is something that is maybe also missing in the Myanmar context. And so civil society and the young generation now out on the street maybe also needs to get more politically active and so on.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Bridget?
Well, you know, you always begin by saying we agree with the previous speakers. And I'd like to add on a little bit in terms of the conversation. I think Larry is right that the military has basically really raised the stakes in such a way that it's going to backfire longer term on them. And I think this is something that we're seeing from the protests. I'd say there are 2 or 3 things that need to be done moving forward. Number one is the protesters need support. They need support not just in solidarity, but also in terms of assistance, in terms of technology, some financial support, and in terms of also helping to empower different alternative opposition voices within Myanmar, including those that are supporting the NLD. I think the second thing is that the military, there needs to be an exit option for the military. That exit option has to come from partly through facilitation of dialogue and others, but I also think it's not just about saving face. There has to be some parts of the military or individuals in the military they can blame as they move forward and find another way of moving to a different direction, creating an exit option. And then number 3, there needs to be amelioration of the consequences of this government staying in power, which are increased conflict, issues of potential refugee crisis, and issues of dealing with support for people who will be potential victims of this government. There needs to be more initiatives to be conscious of this and to plan for responses for the fallout of this government, including an economic crisis that may come that would be very devastating. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bridget. Now may I invite Jod Singh, my research assistant, to say the vote of thanks. Jod?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much, speakers, for giving us this insightful discussion on the military coups and the situation in Myanmar. With this, it gives me a great honor to propose the vote of thanks to everyone who is present today, who made this seminar a resounding success. I would like to give a hearty vote of thanks on the behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies to all our distinguished speakers present today for imparting their insightful views and opinions on the topic. The plight of Myanmar and the very narrative, the meta-narrative that will be coming out of this military coup is very quintessential for understanding the implications of governance and democracy in Myanmar. Dr. Larry Jagan's perceptions on military's intentions in juxtaposition to the elections, right? Dr. John G. Dale's ideas of how the authoritarianism is on a rise in this form of cyber surveillance. Dr. Marco Bunter's notions of how democratization will take place, and Dr. Bridget Welsh's analysis of the past and the future mediation processes have been able to contribute substantially to the discussion, and for that we are quite careful. I would also like to thank Dr. Negin Pao Kipkin for being chair for today's sessions and inciting us with his questions and remarks on the issues. For that, we hope that everyone who joined us today was enlightened with this discussion, and we hope to see everyone for Center's future seminars on various topics regarding Southeast Asian politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. With that, we come to the end of our session. In fact, we went over 10 minutes beyond the schedule. So I would once again, as a chair and as a executive director of the center, I would like to once again thank all the speakers, Larry, John, Marco, and Bridget. I hope to see you again, hopefully, if not in person, virtually again in the near future. And we wish you all the best. And of course, let's continue to do what we can and in a bid to promote democracy and human rights in Myanmar. Thank you, everyone. Good night and good day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night, everyone.
Night. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Vishnu, are you still there?
Yes, sir. I'm there.
Okay, you can end the recording.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, Vishnu.